So my name is John, Director with Cross-Cultural Communications. We host what is now actually a monthly webinar series. We were doing it bi-monthly. It started out bi-monthly with COVID as just a resource for interpreters. And now we're kind of in a post-COVID phase. So we feel it makes sense to do it on a monthly basis and just ensure we're providing CEUs for all the interpreters who support us so wonderfully, just free CEUs, bring a thought leader, wonderful trainer. I'll get into Carola in a little bit on a monthly basis to go through a relevant, timely, informative educational topic. Before we get into Carola, into her presentation, into her bio, she's really remarkable. I did want to go through a few of what we have going on. Don't laugh, it's very true. You're incredible, Carola.
Thank you, John.
The upcoming trainings. So we have in June, we have glossary building for translators and interpreters. I am going to put the links into the chat for everyone. So it's about essentially glossaries, language neutral 4-hour workshop that supports translators and interpreters who work in any language pair. So that is on June 9th. That will be, the instructor will be Laurence, who actually was the webinar host presenter last time. I will put links to that in the chat. Then early June, we have ABCs of IEPs, how to interpret individual education plans effectively. IEPs are hugely challenging. It's been a little bit since I've done an IEP, but when I have done them, in about an hour and a half, I feel like I've done about 5 hours worth of work. They are hugely challenging. You really have to be on in terms of your note taking, in terms of your terminology, in terms of just the environment you're thrown into within educational settings. You have occupational therapists, school psychologists, school counselor, administrators, teachers, etc. So how do we work effectively within those environments? How do you, and Holly Silvestri is remarkable. She's been teaching those for a long time, so they always get incredible reviews. In June, we have modify your accent, communication training, and accent modification for interpreters and non-interpreters. This is relevant to everyone that wants to modify their accent a little bit. That is taking place June 10th and June 17th. I will put that in the chat. Last but not least, we also have the training of trainers. And you'll correct me if I missed anything. We have the training of trainers in July. So if you're interested, that is July 10th to July 28th. That is Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 12 p.m. Eastern to 5 p.m. Eastern. Carola is actually going to be one of the instructors. We'll have James check on next month. He's going to be the other instructor. So that's 3-week course. If you're interested in becoming a licensed to train interpreters in the most trusted and comprehensive entry-level program in the field, the Community Interpreter International, this is for you. It's really the core of what we do as CCC is teach the 40-hour course. If you want to become licensed to teach that course, this is it. It's in July. Again, I'm going to put links in the chat. And now,
and I guess I have to promote my own workshop, June 24th, for the symbols and note taking. So for everyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about that note-taking technique, you can join me on June 24th. I'll be teaching a 4-hour class. At that point, we start at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and hopefully many of you will join for that as well.
Thank you, Carola. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. So those are just available. We just want to do some quick updates. And so Carola, just getting into Carola's background. So Carola is a multilingual. So it's Spanish, German, English, freelance translator and interpreter, and French, with over 15 years of experience working with government industry at executive and operational levels. She's done a lot of diplomat interpreting. She holds 2 university degrees in translation studies from the Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina, She has a Spanish-German interpreting diploma, as well as a 3-year Spanish-English interpreting course, which she completed in 2008. She moved to Atlanta in 2015 and became a federally court certified interpreter. This is hugely impressive. Usually the exams for federal court certification have about a 4 to 5% passage rate. She works as a freelance conference interpreter for various local and international clients. And she is one of the voices of a major news network where she interprets live shows that are broadcasted through this news channel to Spanish-speaking viewers. She's also a licensed trainer. So I want to go ahead and hand it over to Carola. I don't want to take any more of your time. She is going to get into practice with a purpose, which is a presentation I saw, and I'm hugely excited to share with everyone else. Thank you, Carola.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. It's always exciting to be here and to share a little bit of what I have learned over the years in the course of the next hour with you. I will share my screen in an instant. You can use the Q&A function to write all your questions in there. And then at the end of my presentation, John and I will go over those and try to answer as many as possible. I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible for a webinar. So I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions, and you can use the chat to write your answers in there. Hopefully you will not fall asleep during my presentation, and hopefully you have pen and paper ready to sort of take some notes during this training and follow along with me. So here is my presentation. And the title that I chose, let me just open the chat box. Where is the chat now? Okay, I was going to open the chat so that I can follow along, and here I have it. And so the title of my presentation is Practice with a Purpose. And why is that important? Because we need a practical approach to improve our interpreting skills. And this is what we are going to cover today together, right? So a little bit of a roadmap here real quick of what I'm trying to convey to you today. We're going to talk about deliberate practice, what it is, what it constitutes, what is a good practice session for us interpreters, how we can provide good feedback, what are some of the tools that are available to us. I say some of the tools, but because there's so many tools available for all of us that we just want to make sure that we cover a couple. And then by the end of the presentation, we're going to discuss what SMART goals are. And hopefully all of you will by then have a little more knowledge and know how to tackle this idea of the deliberate practice. So let's dive into this. I don't think I need to talk a little more about myself because John just made a really nice introduction. Just a couple of more details. I've been passionate about languages ever since I was a child. I was actually interpret for students that would come to our school and not speak Spanish so that they knew what they had to do. Yes, I've been a freelance for over 15 years. I really enjoy that. I have university degrees. I am an ATA certified translator as well on top of my interpreting credentials. I am the current chair of the Ethics and Standards Committee for the American Association of Interpreters and Translators in Education. And I'm also the president of the Atlanta Association of Interpreters and Translators, which is the Georgia chapter of ATA. And as John mentioned, I am a voice of a major news network, and we provide live interpretation for broadcasts into Spanish. So let's see if we can launch the poll, John, please. I don't know if I have access to that at the moment. Let me see if I can. John, can you launch the poll? Wonderful. So here we have the poll. The first question is, how often do you practice? And I'm not going to judge anybody. I just want to see what the overall feeling is for people in the room and how this is moving forward. So I want to know from you how often you practice, if you practice like every day or 3 times a week, maybe once a week, maybe only from time to time, or if you don't really practice at all, which is fine too. And maybe you will change your mind about that by the end of the webinar. And then I will also want to know, how do you practice? Do you practice by yourself, with a buddy, with a tutor, with a group? And if you see the poll, please click on one of the answers. I see in the chat that some of you have said that they practice by themselves. and every day, but I would like to have the answers in the poll so that we can see the results and discuss those. Okay, I see that somebody wrote down review vocabulary, somebody with a buddy, booth partner, if they have an upcoming event, by myself twice a week. If working daily is considered a life practice, well, we will get to that. I'm not going to spill the beans just right now. And if we have some results in the poll, then maybe we can share those results with everybody and close the poll to see what the results are. Okay, so 24 of you about every day, 16, 3 days a week, and only 10% of you don't really practice. Well, that's pretty good that we have so many in the room who actually do practice. We will get into that, and maybe by the end of the presentation, you will change your mind and consider if you really practice or not. And then most of you practice by themselves, and only very few of you with a buddy or with a group, and none of you with a tutor. Okay, this is really interesting. So we will dive a little bit deeper into that during the course of the presentation. Thank you for answering the question and for helping me out to gear this presentation towards what you need. So let's start with an example. Let's say that you have 2 basketball players. Player A practices 200 shots. He has a colleague who passes the ball to them and a colleague who keeps records of the shots missed. And then every 10 minutes, they review the results. And then we have player B, who in the same time frame practices 50 shots, retrieves his own ball, dribbles leisurely across the field, takes breaks to talk to his friends who are sitting by the sideline, and who does not keep track of the results. Who do you think will have better results? Player A or player B? Okay, I see a lot of A's. Good. I like that. So let's see how we could translate that for us interpreters in the interpreting world, or even for translators, right? Because this is also applicable to those of us who work in the translation field. Okay, I see the unanimous answer is A. Great. So let's say we have 2 interpreters. We have interpreter A, who practices 5 minutes in between assignments, who writes down unknown words on their notepad, but never records themselves. And then we have interpreter B, who practices 1 time a week, who a person that, or an interpreter that actually researches unknown terminology and adds it to a glossary, and then records their practice sessions and listens to the rendition. So which of these interpreters is going to have better results long term? Okay, I see everybody agrees that it's going to be interpreter B. And this is important because this is where deliberate practice comes in, right? So what is deliberate practice? Does anybody know what deliberate practice is, or what some of the elements of deliberate practice could be? This is a very special type of practice. This is not just sitting down and repeating. Okay. Okay, specific focus, exactly. We focus on a skill, it is planned, we set a schedule, we take notes, we practice to improve. Yes, all of that is true. So it is purposeful, right? We work on a specific goal, on a specific purpose. This is why we say that it is purpose-driven, right? It is purposeful. It is systematic because there is a system behind our practice. It's not just we just sit down and say, okay, today I'm going to practice a little bit. It is not just mindless repetition, okay? It requires focused attention. We work with a specific goal of improving our performance. So it's not just practicing for the sake of practicing. We practice because we want to improve our performance. And this goal that we have, we break it into little segments. And then we build on feedback. That means that we have to analyze our own performance in order to be able to see where we're actually going with this. Okay? So why do we need deliberate practice? Why are repetitions just not enough? Okay? Why do we actually need to make the effort of sitting down, of having a system for our practice, of analyzing our performance? Why is this needed? So in the beginning, the most important thing for us is just to show up and repeat. And this is important because in the beginning, we need to repeat behaviors in order for them to become automatic, right? So for example, we need to do a lot of shadowing in the beginning when we want to improve our simultaneous interpretation. We need to do memory exercises to improve our consecutive, and we need to practice our note-taking. Or even if we're translators, we might just need to focus on little aspects of grammar or collocations just to make sure that we get in the habit and that we can automate these habits, right? And once we show up and we repeat, our brain transforms repeated behaviors into automatic habits. Like, do you remember when you learned how to tie your shoes? Probably when you were about 6 years old, and that might have been really hard at the point because you had to really think about it and divide the task and then loop and loop and then which lace goes under which in order to have the knot in the end. But now your brain can perform the sequence automatically. And probably if you had to break it down, the sequence of tying your shoes, if you had to break it down and you had to explain it to somebody step by step, like a young child who's just learning to tie their shoes, maybe you would have to think about it, and maybe you would have some difficulty doing that because the steps are so automated in your brain, right? The problem with that is when behaviors become automatic and we start repeating tasks, they become very mindless. So after a while, we start to overlook errors and we miss opportunities for improvement, right? We just do it automatically because we know how it is, right? And if we constantly do the same in the beginning, it might really help, but it won't get us anywhere later on once we get used to doing it. Yeah, like the first time you decide that you want to go for a run and you run like a mile and a half and you're exhausted after that. And then you just start doing you start exercising a little bit more, and then you get used to the distance, and then you need a new challenge, a new goal, and then suddenly you're able to run 5 miles. But in order to get to the 5 miles, you had to break it down. You started running like a mile, then maybe a mile and a half, then maybe you did some cycling in between that, and then you started running 3 miles. Well, the same happens with interpreting. The problem is that if we just continue repeating the same thing that we have been doing so far, is that instead of getting better with experience, you're just reinforcing current habits. So we're not getting any better. We're just reinforcing current habits. And there might be a lot of mistakes involved in that. And we miss opportunities to actually improve our performance. So it is really important for us to go back to the basics once in a while, to take a look at on how we are doing things, how well we are doing them, and then find a way to improve. And this is not just practicing for the purpose or for the sake of practicing. This is really purpose-driven practice, right? So deliberate practice requires a sustained effort and concentration. It doesn't do us any good if we sit down and practice now and then maybe in 2 or 3 months again, and then maybe next year. Okay, this needs to be a sustained effort. It means that we have to practice on a regular basis and we have to be focused. It requires concentration. We cannot just not do it, oh, in between assignments, just because I have a 5-minute break, I'm just going to sit down and practice. It might help to get you somewhere, but that's not the purpose of deliberate practice. We're going to break down our goals into tiny tasks. Okay, we need to really sort of take the big achievement that we want to have into little steps that we can accomplish. And this is also sort of a commitment to lifelong learning, because deliberate practice never really stops. Okay, it is always a way of improving our skills, especially in an environment, in a field like ours. We constantly need to be working on our skills, different types of skills. In the beginning, we need to probably work more on our interpreting skills, and then later on, once we have more experience, we might work on fine-tuning those skills or increasing our vocabulary. But it's a lifelong commitment to learning, and this deliberate practice has long-term results. So let's look at an example for simultaneous interpreting. First of all, we will start shadowing. And we will start, for example, with a slow speaker. We record ourselves, we listen to our recording, and then we analyze if we were able to repeat everything, if we pronounce the words correctly. Did we use any filler words? Did we have false starts and needed to backtrack and then start over again? And once we believe that we feel comfortable with the shadowing, we will move on, and then we will do shadowing and dual tasking, right? So we shadow a speaker with a different recording, and then we start taking notes at the same time. And then we repeat the exercise with faster speeches until we get to a point where we really make hardly any mistakes. And then once we have a good command of this skill as well, for example, the shadowing and the dual tasking, then we move on to next task and we make it more difficult. We say, okay, we're going to write down numbers, not just whatever the speaker is saying in his speech. Maybe we can start writing down our shopping list, our to-do list, to work on this dual task of separating our mind from the task of interpreting itself and everything else that it entails. But we always need to listen to ourselves. We always need to record ourselves and analyze our performance in order to make sure that we are doing a good job with this. And then we can start paraphrasing. And then the final step is interpreting. So as you said, if the goal is to improve our simultaneous interpretation, we break that goal down into little steps. And I know that this is like a very burdensome and lengthy process, but we need to invest a good amount of time. And sometimes we need to go back to the basics, especially when we reach a plateau. When we reach a plateau and we feel that we're not improving and we're not moving forward, that is a good time for us to go back to the basics. And we need to keep track of our progress, right? We need to be able to say, okay, well, now I started interpreting after I was able to shadow a speaker at 160 words per minute flawlessly. I didn't have any false starts, I didn't have fillers, and my diction was perfect. So now that we've discussed what deliberate practice entails, let's look at what a good practice session looks like. First of all, we would have to define the skill or aspect you will want to work on. So do we want to work on consecutive? Do we want to work on simultaneous? If we're dealing with the translation realm, do we want to work on collocations and the correct use of prepositions, or maybe verb tenses? Do we want to work on an interpreting skill as such, like consecutive or simultaneous, or do we want to work on specific aspects like false starts and self-corrections or filler words, right? So this is very important. We need to define what the goal of our practice session is. Then we need to prepare our session, which means what materials will I be working with? Do I use YouTube? Will I be using a script? Do I have exercises lined up for my warm-up? What is the material that I'm going to use for my main practice session? And a good suggestion for that is to use material from the previous practice session just as a warm-up, because that will allow you to sort of see if you've really managed to incorporate the little tiny things that you worked on during the previous session. You need to find an appropriate length, whatever works for you, right? So how long can you stay focused? Is it 45 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it maybe 90 minutes? I personally find that for me, 60 minutes is sometimes a little bit too short, especially if I have not prepared the session in advance. And between 90 minutes and 2 hours is a good time frame. Usually, I tend to lean towards 2 hours if you're practicing with somebody else or with a study group, because you also need to have enough time in order to be able to discuss within the group. And what is very important is you need to include time to review. That means you need to include time to listen to your recording. You need to include time to look up any vocabulary that you stumbled across during your practice session. And what is also very important is that you need to track your progress. You need to analyze your mistakes, and you need to write down what you did well, what you could improve, what if you achieved your goal for the session, and what your goal for the next session will be. Let's take a look at a couple of different scenarios, because based on what we're working on, the scenario might be a little bit different, right? So when we're working on our interpreting skills, a practice session would usually include setting a goal, determining the time frame, that is how long we're going to be working on this goal, on this skill, looking for the material, maybe do some research ahead of time. If we're going to work on a topic that we're not really familiar with, we might want to read a couple of texts in the target language just to make sure that we have the vocabulary that we will need during our practice handy. Then we do the actual interpreting practice. Then we analyze the recording. Then based on listening to our recording, we're going to research the vocabulary. And if we still have time, we're going to repeat the sequence again, sometimes with the same recording, sometimes with a different recording, depending on how you feel and how it went. And then you need to track your progress, right? Keep like a diary of what you're doing, when you practice, how long you practice, what it entails, etc. If your goal is to increase vocabulary, then we will also set a goal. We will say, okay, today I want to incorporate 10 new words or 10 new symbols or whatever specific vocabulary goal you have. And then you determine your time frame. It's like, okay, I'm going to practice for about an hour or 90 minutes, depending on you have. You find the material, you do your research, you work on creating your glossary, maybe your flashcards. There's a nice app for that for tablets. That you can use to sort of draw your symbols that you develop for the vocabulary and then have it as an additional way of practicing. You practice the vocabulary in context. This is very important. There's no purpose in just trying to memorize vocabulary without context, because we need to know how to use the vocabulary and when to use it. And as always, we repeat and we track our progress, right? And then as totally different scenario is if we are preparing for a certification or an accreditation exam. Obviously, we will still have a goal, but the first important thing here is that we need to study the examination manual. We need to know what the accreditation exam or the certification exam will entail. Why? Because we need to practice under exam conditions. So for example, court interpreters, whenever they get ready to sit for their national exam of the language consortium, they know that they will have 6 minutes to complete their first sight translation exercise, and that they will have 2 minutes to read the text and then 4 minutes to deliver. So what should those applicants do? They should find a text of approximately the same length that the sight translation text will have at the exam, and then time themselves to do the exercise in 6 minutes. If you're preparing for the medical certification exam of CCHI, for example, then you know that consecutive constitutes about 75% of the evaluation. So that is probably the skill that you want to work on most, because this is what you will have to reinforce. You will need to nail your consecutive in order to pass the exam. If you're taking the English to English exam of CCHI, then you know that you need to practice some shadowing, you need to study terminology and learn equivalents, you need to practice paraphrasing. And how do you know all of that? Because the first thing you did is you studied the examination manual and you know what is expected of you during that examination. And this applies to any kind of certification or accreditation exam that is out there. So there's several. You could think about the same thing for the ATA translation examination, right? You know that within a specific time frame of approximately 2 hours, you will have to translate 3 short paragraphs of different topics. And then maybe once you get ready, you sit down and you say, okay, today I'm going to practice under exam conditions. And then you choose 3 paragraphs and you translate those into your target language, and you make sure that you analyze everything that you have done. And you also analyze them according to the scoring details that the certification entity shares with all the candidates. So of course, as I said, if you do practice translation, you obviously correct your translations. You make sure that everything is in there, that it is right. If you're doing interpreting practice for an accreditation exam, you analyze the recording, you go back to researching the terminology, you repeat, and then obviously you track your progress. So here is the big question. And the question is, how often should you practice? And this is probably my favorite answer for almost any question that pops up in the interpreting and translation domain. And the answer is, it depends. So we're going to look back at our different scenarios. And the first scenario is, if you're a novice interpreter, then you might need more practice to automate your skills. And that is the first thing. When you're just starting out in this profession, you need to automate your skills. You need to automate the fact of being able to take notes while you're listening during your consecutive. You need to be able to shadow. You need to be able to do some dual tasking in your simultaneous. The same also applies if if you're taking up interpreting after a break, for example, if you've been on maternity leave, or if you're taking another leave to take care of a family member after surgery, for example, or if you've been on a very long vacation, then you might want to start practicing your interpreting skills again. Skill acquisition usually requires more practice than the acquisition of new vocabulary. So when you're practicing to improve your vocabulary or to increase your vocabulary, then you might need to practice a little bit less. And you can just focus your practice session specifically on vocabulary, which is very different from practicing interpreting skills, where you need to take into account a whole other type of commitment and details and habits and automation. When you're practicing for a certification or an accreditation exam, this is a very specific type of practice, right? Because you are focusing exactly on adapting your practice to the exam requirements. So you're not only working on your interpreting skills, and you're not only working on incorporating all that specific vocabulary that you will need for that certification or accreditation exam, you're also working on and practicing on being able to deliver your best performance under exam conditions. And that is why I always highlight this fact. I think that it is very important when you're preparing for a certification exam to practice exactly as the exam will be in real life. Because otherwise, if you just practice for the sake of practicing, you don't know how you will do during the certification exam. You don't know if the simultaneous portion of the certification exam is too long for you, if it is too fast for you, if you cannot keep up, if you're having trouble breathing, if you have a lot of filler words, if you're having trouble just getting into it. You need to practice under exam conditions. And then you might need to intensify practice sessions prior to the exam, right? If you're just practicing to increase your skills because you're a novice interpreter or you have been out of the field for a while, maybe 2 to 3 practice sessions a week is enough. But maybe if you're taking an accreditation exam in a month from now, you may want to practice 4 to 5 days a week just to make sure that you have enough time to prepare for all of it. But also be careful not to overdo it, because our brain also needs time to rest and to assimilate all of the knowledge. And we do not want to get to the date of the certification exam exhausted. So pace yourselves. What is really important is that you schedule time to practice. You're not going to practice if you're just going to say, oh, okay, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll do it sometime this week. It doesn't work that way. Things come up, you end up doing the laundry, or walking the dog, or going to lunch with a friend, or maybe you take on an assignment that you hadn't planned on taking on. So it's really important that you log time in your calendar and that you save that time for practice. It could be Saturday morning when you know that you're not going to have any other assignments. It could be on a Tuesday evening when you know that your partner is on their friend's night out, and that you can do that while the kids are sleeping. You can do that early in the morning. You can hire a babysitter once a week for a couple of hours just so that you can get your study time and your practice time. But it is important that you schedule it and that you honor that commitment to yourself. Nobody's going to come up to you and say, hey, did you practice today? This commitment is with yourself, and you need to hold yourself accountable for this. And that's why a study partner is sometimes so useful, because then at least there's 2 of you who are committed to making the best effort and to making the best out of this. And also, if you are working a lot, you might consider assessing your performance at work. This is also a little bit tricky because we cannot record ourselves while we are at work for confidentiality reasons. If you do simultaneous interpreting and there is a recording of the interpretation on the internet, you might want to analyze snippets of that recording that is publicly available. But please, confidentiality always comes first. So assessing your performance at work can be useful, but it does not necessarily fulfill the same goal as delivered practice. Okay, so I see the question here about the examination manual. The examination manuals are usually available by the different entities that offer the certification exams. So on the website for CCHI, for example, there is the examination manual. The same for the different court systems throughout the country. They also have certification manuals that you can download. You can print if you want, but you can definitely download and read through them. Not once, not twice, but at least 3 times, I would suggest, so that you get very familiarized with what you need to prepare for. Let's talk a little bit about feedback. And I want to know if anybody can share with me what good feedback entails. It could be feedback for yourself or feedback when you work with somebody else. Can anybody share in the chat with me what they think before I spill the beans? Constructive criticism, specific, I like that. Start with the positive, okay? Be honest, okay? Identify strong and weak points, ask questions, be neutral and objective, be detailed, the sandwich type, good. Wonderful, make specific comments, say what went well, give specific points to improve, all of the above. Yes, wonderful, be professional about it, definitely. So first of all, you need to reflect on how it went. If you're working with somebody else, the first thing you do is ask the other person who you are giving feedback to is, how do they feel about their performance? And this is very useful because they might mention something that you were going to mention too, and now you don't have to do it anymore. And it sort of lightens the mood a little bit, right? You can highlight things that were well done. That's always very important. And you should also identify a few things that can be done better. Right? And the idea of the sandwich approach is that you start out with a positive comment, then you make some remarks on what can be improved, and then you end on a positive note. Please, please, please always be kind. We're all humans, we all make mistakes. And it's really important that we can learn from this feedback in order to improve our performance, sorry. So we want to be kind to everybody else, kind to ourselves as well, right? And we can provide the feedback orally, like when we're studying together, I can tell the other person what I believe would be a good item for them to work on. We can provide feedback in writing if you're practicing asynchronously, that is everybody, each member of the study team on their own time. Maybe we can even add notes to a transcript if we have a transcript, or we can record an audio file, or if we're working with a video that we share, then we can always add the comments with timestamps to the specific sections that the other person needs to focus on. And what is also very important is that we need to focus on overarching themes, especially if we're working with a goal. If our study partner has shared their goal with us, then we should take advantage and focus on specifics that our study buddy is working on. So for example, if they say, I'm working on not having as many filler words, then we're not going to start talking about all the vocabulary that they said incorrectly or all about the verbs that they misconjugated. We're just going to focus on saying, hey, you did so much better than last time. You only had 3 filler words this time compared to the 10 you had the previous time. But also, I wanted to point out that there were a lot of issues with verb conjugation. So that is an overarching theme, right? We're not going to point out every little detail that they need to work on, because then they cannot digest all of that and they cannot work on everything at the same time. So we need to focus on an overarching theme. If that's something that is repetitive, if it's a mistake that we observe often, that is something that we want to point out to them, but we do not want to get lost in the details. And what is also important is that it is specific. We want to make sure that we can provide some examples of when they made the mistake and in what context. And maybe that will also give them a clue in order to be able to analyze how they can avoid making that mistake in the future. When we analyze our own performance, we need to be as objective as possible. And I know that that is hard because we're sort of evaluating, you know, our own performance, but sometimes we think we are much better than we actually are, and we take this very lightly. And other times we're way too harsh on ourselves. So we really need to strike that balance in order to really gain something from listening to ourselves and from analyzing our own performance. And what is important is that we focus on performance, that we focus on how we did overall, and not just, as I said before, the tiny itty-nitty-gritty details, right? And the other element that is important is that we need to focus on how we can improve our mistakes. If we just write down what we did wrong, then it's not useful. We need to find out how can I make this better? What was my issue? Was my issue with vocabulary? Okay, then I'm going to schedule a session to practice my vocabulary before I work on my interpreting skill. What was it? Was it my short-term memory? Okay, then maybe I need to work on some memory exercises. So maybe I need to work on my note-taking to be able to improve that side of the skill. So we really need to analyze and go deeper into what is going on. What goes hand in hand with this and what is really important is that we need to track our progress. We need to have like a diary or an Excel spreadsheet. We can use Airtable for that. Why? Because progression is important. We need to set a higher goal as we move along, and we need to know what we're working on. So I'm going to share a couple of examples with you right now from my own personal practice sessions, and you're not allowed to laugh at me. This is a first example. At this point, this is a few years back, I was trying to, back in the days when I first started out as an interpreter, I was working a lot in the German-Spanish language pair. And since I've moved to the US, that's a language pair that I hardly ever work with. So I was trying to get it back off the back burner and sort of activate that language pair again. And this is how I was tracking my progress at the time. And this goes on and on and on. I just took like a couple of columns so that you can see what this was like. So we have the dates, then we have the source I was working with, the beginner. Of course, the language combination is German to Spanish because that is what the specific language combination that I was working on at the moment. The topic, what it was, what my goal was to get a general feeling of where I was standing, maybe just practice. And here we have one where I was really trying to challenge myself. The duration of the speech I was working with, and then evaluation regarding content first. How did I do with names and numbers? How complete was my rendition? Was the message consistent with the original? Did I convey the speaker's emotion and intention? Was there logical cohesion to my speech? And I usually grade myself from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest scale. But as you can see, I was working at a beginner level. So given that I have a lot of interpreting practice, this was not really that challenging for me at the point. And then of course I started increasing the level of the challenge, but I wanted to start out with the basics just to make sure where I was, just to be able to know what items or what of these aspects I had to work on in order to get myself to the next level. Then I looked at language. Did I have any interference, language interfering? Were my sentences complete? How was the terminology, the grammar, my accent, my style and register, presentation? How is my breathing? Could I hear me breathing in the recording, right? Did I have a lot of filler words like uhs and ahs or kind of false starts, right? What was my attitude? How was my intonation? And then of course, regarding the process, how was my décalage? Did I have a lot of self-corrections? How was my speed? How was my stamina? Was I able to keep up with the rendition throughout the entire presentation? So this is one example. So let's look at another example. So this is an example where I was, on top of working on my interpreting skills, I was working on vocabulary. So you see on the left-hand side, you have the identifier for the material I was working with. And then I was working in the combination of French, English, and Spanish. So I would do vocabulary research in French, in English, and in Spanish just to see how that could best fit and actually, see how my progress was. And then I was obviously doing the interpreting practice, but I was combining them with vocabulary and researching and finding other ways of formulating the same things that I had used during my own rendition. And here we have another one where you can see the link to the recording, the language that I was working on, the different speeches that I did during that, within that specific link, the length of those speeches, the group, the type of practice, if I was practicing by myself or if I was with a group practice, what the goal was. Like in this case, we had a group practice, so my goal at that specific practice was to provide feedback to somebody else. And then the comments that I have, the results of the practice. And for example, here it says that I needed to repeat the statement made by Morocco Here it means that I had a few items missed and that I need to review some of the military vocab. So this was a good way for me at the time to track my progress and how I was doing. And this is very personal. So this is what helps me. Maybe there's something else that helps you. Maybe there are different metrics that you want to use. Maybe you want to structure it differently. That is very personal. So you need to find out what works best for you. So let's dive a little bit into the tools that you have available, right? Tools for collaboration when you're working with others, or tools when you're studying by yourself. So what tools can you think of? Would you like to share some in the chat? Come on. Notebook, quiet room, phone, website, podcast, dictionary, voice recorder, recording, pen, Audacity, glossary, textbooks, flashcards. Wonderful. Yes, that is great. A good headset, definitely. Pen and paper, notebook, YouTube. Yes, all of those are totally valid. And we're going to touch upon a couple of them. Another person. Yes, that is definitely a good tool. More than a tool, I would say that's a resource, but definitely valid. So let's talk about the one that we're all very familiar with, which is Zoom. Zoom is a great collaborative tool to meet with colleagues. You all know that there's a free version where you can meet up to 40 minutes, and then there's the paid version. So you have to decide if it actually suits your needs to get the paid version. I have a paid version, but I also use it for many different things. Zoom is also wonderful to record yourself. Okay, not only audio, but also video. So if you're practicing consecutive and you know that you're going to have an assignment in consecutive, maybe what you want to use Zoom for is to record yourself how you're doing your consecutive interpretation. What is your body language? Do you have any facial expressions? Do you manage to stay neutral when you're not quite sure what you're going to say? This is also very important, especially for those who work in the community setting and who do a lot of consecutive. You need to make sure to record yourself on video, just to make sure that your body language and your facial expressions stay neutral. I mean, you can obviously also use other apps for that. There's VLC or maybe QuickTime, depending on whether you use a Windows, Microsoft-based, or maybe Apple products. There's apps on your that you can download for this purpose, but Zoom is a very good tool for that. Then, of course, there is Audacity. And Audacity, for those of you who don't know the program, is a program that you can use to listen to several tracks, audio tracks at the same time. So you can have the audio track of the speech that you're using to practice with, then you can record yourself, and then you can listen to both tracks simultaneously, one in each ear, just to see how you are doing with your own interpretation. Then you have automatic transcription tools, and this applies specifically to your own recordings for which you can use them, or you can use this with videos that are publicly available. And why are transcription tools important for us? Because sometimes we only have the audio, but we need or it is useful for us to have a transcript in order to be able to follow along more closely. And sometimes we just want to transcribe our own performance, our own recordings of the interpretation that we did, in order to be able to analyze where we have grammar mistakes and where we're missing the concordance between the verb and the subject. And that is very useful. So Sonics, for example, offers several languages. Otter is a good one that I use, but that one is in English only. So you have to play around a little bit and see what works best for you. And then we have Google Docs, which is really a great tool if you're working with somebody else in a collaborative manner. You can give the other person editing access, so you can both add to the glossary that you're working with. You can have the docs available on several devices. You don't need to be in front of your computer to be able to access the glossaries, for example. You can do that on your tablet, on your phone. This is just, in my opinion, a wonderful tool. You can even do that with OneDrive from Microsoft, and then you can also use Airtable or instead of an Excel sheet if you prefer that. That is very personal choice. Then we have term extraction tools, and this is specifically useful when we're working more in the simultaneous conference realm, where we do have parallel texts, where we have, for example, different laws or regulations that where there exists an official translation, and we can just put those two texts, parallel texts, into the extraction tool, and they will pull out a glossary for us based on the documents. This is also handy when we have very little time to prepare for an assignment. And then, of course, we have file sharing, which you probably know. You can use Google Drive, you can use WeTransfer, you can use Dropbox, and then that is a all different kind of, park ball that you can explore, see what works best for you. And of course, as you all mentioned, you can use podcasts and YouTube as your study material. There's plenty of material out there on the internet that is freely available to all of you. So I have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to give you some time to ask some questions. So I hope you all have pen and paper handy, as like every good interpreter should have, always a notepad there to write down a couple of things. So I want to say you to set a goal. Now we have all discussed what deliberate practice is about, and you know where you're going to go into where you want to go as your next step in your interpreting career. Now we are going to set a goal, but it's not going to be just any goal. It is going to be what I call, or what is commonly known in the industry as a SMART goal, okay? So the goal that you're going to work with has to be specific. There's no point in saying, oh, I want to be a certified interpreter within the next 10 years. That is not very specific. What type of certified interpreter do you want to be? If you say, for example, I want to attain CCHI certification or MBCMI certification during the next testing window in the second half of 2023, that is a very specific goal. And that will also allow you to make the goal measurable. That is, see what steps you need to take in order to get there, right? So it needs to be measurable. For example, if we're taking a certification exam, we can break it down into the little steps of the certification exam and work on each of those goals independently and measure how we're doing, how we're progressing towards that goal of becoming certified. It needs to be actionable, which means that you can take action on it. It doesn't matter if you say, oh, I want to become certified. Yeah, okay, but what are you going to do about that? How are you going to get there? So if we say we want to get certified, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to check out the website. We're going to look at that examination manual. We are going to see when the next test dates are. We are going to also analyze what are the requirements. What do we need to do in order to actually be admitted to sit for that exam? It has to be realistic. If we're just a beginning interpreter and we've just had 2 or 3 assignments and we say we want to get certified in a month, that's probably not very realistic. But if we say we want to get certified within the next 2 years and take advantage to gain some experience and to increase our vocabulary and to maybe consult with colleagues or attend a conference, that is much more realistic. Yes? So the reality, or what realistic means, obviously also depends on our background. If we're just starting out, our goal is going to be completely different from somebody who's been in the field for over 15 years. And then we need a goal that is time-bound. We need to set a date or at least a time frame by which we would like to achieve that goal, because otherwise we're not going to hold ourselves accountable, right? So let's talk about a completely different example that is not related to the interpreting practice. Let's say that you are an independent contractor and you work with 5 agencies. And then you set a new goal and you say, by the end of the year, I would like to work with 5 additional local languages. This is a very specific goal, right? And it is time bound because we say we want to achieve this by the end of the year. It is measurable because as we contact agencies and maybe obtain new clients, we can measure how much progress we have made. It is actionable because I can take steps. I can contact those agencies I want to work with and say, hey, I'm an interpreter, I'm certified, or I'm starting out. I would like the opportunity to work with you. Could we have a phone conversation, for example? It is actionable. Is it realistic? Yes. If I say that I want to work with 5 additional agencies, that means have 5 additional new clients. That is a very realistic goal. If I say that I want to work with 60 new agencies, that's not very realistic because it's going to be very hard to keep up with that. So remember that if you do not achieve your goal, now you know how to set a new goal and how you can engage in deliberate practice to actually achieve it. And also take into consideration that every opportunity or every time we do not reach our goal, it's a good way for us to take a step back and analyze our own performance and see what we can do better next time. So with that, I would like to thank you all for being here today, and maybe we can answer a few questions.
That was excellent, Carola. Thank you so much. We do have several questions. I think I'll actually start with the Q&A. There are several questions in there. Okay, I have used the FCCI's training videos to practice, but I find it hard to come across material for medical interpreting, both simultaneous and consecutive. This is from Jimena Verdejo. Any suggestions?
So I believe what is very important is that you define what type of material you want to work with. There are a lot of courses out there where you can gain material from. Sometimes it's not just going on YouTube and finding something on the internet. Sometimes we also need to invest in ourselves and in our careers and maybe pay for a course here and there in order to have access to other materials that we would otherwise not have access to. And I know that that might not be the answer that you were hoping for, but unfortunately, that's the way it is. We need to remember that when we invest in ourselves, we invest in our training, we're investing in our future. And we are investing in becoming the best professionals that we can be.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So Ms. Rivera actually has a question, and I'm not entirely clear on it, but how does one measure speaker speed?
Okay, so speaker speed, sometimes there are some apps that show you what the speaker speed is. Otherwise, what you do is you have the total word count of the transcript, for example, and then you divide it by the number of minutes, and that will tell you what the speaker speed is. It's usually the average speaker is about 150 words per minute, and that is pretty fast. So I know that the requirements for some of the certifications exams is about 120 words per minute, which is rather slow. So you can use that in order to sort of see how you're doing and then progress towards faster speakers, which is always very interesting.
Interesting. Carola, I work with employed interpreters, and they feel like they never have time to sit down and do reflective practice. I try to encourage them to do that and put time aside on their schedule, but I believe most of them do not. I also know that some of this practice needs to happen outside of work hours, but I don't know if anyone is willing to do that. Any advice on how to sell this to them, the importance of doing this?
Well, this is a very difficult question to answer, because there is so much related to your own motivation with deliberate practice, right? If you're not motivated, then it's really hard to engage in this kind of practice. It's like, so this is difficult to actually motivate somebody else. You know, a good question that you can start with is maybe sitting down with the person and say, well, hey, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? What are your goals? What field do you want to work in? Because maybe they are comfortable in the kind of department that they are because they know the vocabulary and they know what the proceedings are, but maybe there's a growth opportunity that might, you know, be like a little bit like a carrot that can motivate them to sort of engage in self-practice. That is one way. The other way of doing that is to, if they are employed and they're in-house, then you could schedule like yearly reviews and then have like a supervisor accompany them on an assignment and provide feedback to them and say, hey, I observed this, this, and that. This was very well. This could be improved. Maybe we need to set aside some time to work on these skills. That is one way. And another way of doing that is to inviting them to participate in training courses. And maybe as an institution say, hey, you know what? I know that you have to do CEUs to maintain your certification, but we are also going to have that in requirement internally, and you have to participate in, let's say, for example, 10 hours of continuing education every year. And we as the employer are going to provide you with the opportunity. Here is a list of courses that you can take, and then you keep track of that. So that would be another option.
And just one little housekeeping item. So we're at the hour mark. Just know that you will get your CEU as long as you stayed on for the hour. You're not required to stay any longer. You're free to drop off, but Carola and I are going to stay on and continue answering some questions. Again, we will I'll put the links to the trainings in there as well, but feel free to post your questions. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really enjoyed this conversation. Okay, so we have to train in simultaneous interpretation. Where can we go to hear something being read out loud and at a different speed of speech?
So first of all, the well-known or the best-known resource for that is YouTube. And then, of course, you can use any podcast whatsoever. Sometimes we think that practice needs to be about a boring topic, and it's not at all right like that. You know, you can choose a podcast that you love, that covers topics that fascinate you, and then do your practice with that. I don't want to say that any type of practice is helpful, but it kind of is depending on your goal. So if you're just working if you're working on improving your skills, then you can work with any type of material. If you're working on increasing your vocabulary in a specific domain, you should try to work with material from that specific domain. And then, of course, you have other sources. You have UN Web TV, you have the European Union repository, you have tons of international organization that post videos of presentations, of past conferences, of all the different domains. I mean, the sky is the limit. You have so many options. And then some of them even classify the practice material that they offer according to beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. So that also gives you a cue as to what kind of degree of difficulty you'll be working with.
Would you please share some tips to increase memory during consecutive interpretation?
Okay, so here are two things. When we do consecutive interpreting, we work with short-term memory. So that means that is the information that we store on a very short-term basis in our mind. There are several ways. So there's memory exercises, like, for example, just playing the game memory. That is a good exercise. There is an exercise that you can look at a picture for about 30 seconds, then look away or turn it around and then try to remember as many things as you have. That is another exercise. You can try to remember strains of numbers. That is another exercise. But something that a lot of people forget is that our short-term memory is only going to be as good as our long-term memory. So the more you know, the more you read, the better informed you are about a topic, the more likely it is that your short-term memory is going to serve you well. So if you're working in the medical field, for example, and you've been doing cancer patient care, for example, for 3 years, your short-term memory will function much better because you already have all that background knowledge accumulated in your mind than if suddenly you have to be working with a speech therapist and you've never done speech therapy before. Then your memory is going to be much more under strain and under stress because there's so many new concepts that it has to remember as well, because you don't have that accumulated background knowledge that serves you when you do something over and over again.
Excellent.
And there's tons of memory exercises, and I'm not going to dive into that because we could talk about that for an hour or so.
Right. You spoke about the sandwich mechanism of providing feedback, something positive, some constructive feedback, something positive, emphasizing that we're human, we all make mistakes, it's important to be kind. Do you have any other suggestions, any other resources, materials, books on how to provide constructive feedback?
I think constructive feedback is based a lot on common sense. So is what you're saying kind? Is it helpful? Is it going to be useful to the other person? And is that something that you would like to receive as feedback as well? If something comes out of your mind that you would not want to hear yourself, then you might not want to say it. So think about that in the kind of the mirror kind of view. So if you were to receive the feedback that you're about to give, could you handle that? would you be able to work with it? Would you be able to improve your performance based on what you're saying? And I think that is probably the most important item that we need to take into account. And don't focus on all those tiny little details. Sometimes just giving them one thing and feedback, one thing that they can work on is much more useful than if you start pointing out 10 things at a time.
Yeah, once they don't overload them.
Exactly.
One little piece.
Yes.
How can one, this is from Theolicia Rivera, how can one contact Carola for further training or questions?
Okay, so I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Then I'm teaching the note-taking class with CCC at the end of June. So you've heard about that, and I'd be happy to welcome many of you to that training. What else? Those
Also
are like,
teaching the TOT in
yes,
July?
I'm teaching the TOT. That one's vital. I should not forget that. That is a
Yeah.
very important one. And we have a couple of projects in the works with John for the second half of the year. I'm not going to spill the beans just yet because we are in the process of defining how we're going to do that. So subscribe to the CCC mailing list, and then you'll get the news firsthand when they come out hot out of the oven.
Absolutely. The newsletter comes out every Friday, midday, in your inbox via email. Essentially 3 stories within interpreting, and then a CCC corner, just any updates on what we're doing here at CCC. Could you chat a bit more about term extraction tools?
Oh, okay. So that we would have to schedule a whole different webinar for that specifically. So there are different tools like Interpret Bank, Sketch Engine that are AI tools basically.
Yep.
And you also, Trados used to have a function for that. I'm not sure with what the latest version of Trados is. I haven't been using Trados for a while. Where you would just enter 2 parallel texts, which means 2 texts that are equal, that have exactly the same content. So for example, if we talk about ISO, for example,
Yep.
you could have the same ISO regulation in Spanish and in English, for example, or in English and in French. And if you wanted to extract that terminology, you would have to download both of those texts, once in English, once in French. You feed that to the term extraction tool, and the term extraction tool will analyze the text and then find equivalents within the 2 languages and then put a glossary out for you.
Okay.
So that is like a wonderful tool if you don't have time to build your own glossary. And I
Where
know
was that tool again?
Sketch Engine is one, and then
Sketch
Interpret
Engine.
Bank is another one. Those are just 2 examples out of the many that are there. And the aligned function in Trados, you can use that too to add 2 texts in there. But as far as I remember, it was just mainly to feed your translation memory, not necessarily to use it as an extraction tool.
Okay. Curious about the source of your self-grading tool, your wonderful self-grading tool. What do you recommend?
My grading tool.
Your
Well,
self-evaluation tool.
yes, my self-evaluation tool. It depends on what you're working on. So I have different evaluation tools depending on what I'm working on. If I'm working on vocabulary, if I'm working on interpreting skills, and then I always write down, if I work on interpreting skills, I say, okay, what am I focusing on? Am I doing sight? Am I doing simultaneous? Am I doing consecutive? Because it is important that you identify what skills you're working on in order to be able to evaluate yourself appropriately. And then I also change my tools based on what my needs are at the moment. What am I doing? Am I trying to bring back a language that I haven't worked with in a while to sort of activate it more? Am I preparing for a specific assignment? Am I trying to incorporate new vocabulary on a topic that I haven't worked with in a while? So you can always adapt those to your own needs. I would say that output is very important. Always evaluate your own performance and see how you are doing. And then see what you need to add in. Do you need to, with the fillers, do you need to work more on the language output? Do you have language interference? Then maybe you want to add a couple of things in there. If you have difficulties with intonation or with fillers, then you might want to focus those aspects in your self-evaluation. You can have it, you can make it like very long, very exhaustive, and very complete. Or you can just make it very short and very sweet if you don't want to spend, if you don't focus on too many things at the same time, and if you just want to focus on 2 or 3 things at the moment.
Yeah, excellent. Carola, this is from Laura. After many years interpreting consecutively, I am trying to focus more and more on simultaneous. I have some good experience, booth and RSI, and I am also attending a university course on simultaneous. What would be the one piece of advice to improve to get assignments more easily in this enormous market for my pair, English, Spanish?
Okay. So, well, first of all, I would say don't be afraid to go back to the basics. If that is what you need to do, if you want to improve your interpreting skills, remember that going back to the basics is very useful and will launch you forward faster. So if you're commuting, I mean, put your podcast on and just shadow while you're driving. You'll be dual tasking, right? As long as it doesn't, as long as you keep your eyes on the road and it doesn't distract you too much. So that's a good opportunity to practice that. I think you will probably have to find your niche, see if there's any type of a domain that you're a specialist in and that differentiates you from other interpreters in the field. Yes, it is true that there's a lot of us out there. Yes, it is also true that there's a great need for simultaneous interpreters. Yes, it is also true that you are not necessarily allowed to make a faux pas. So if you're ready to go into the market, make sure that if you accept an assignment that you're up to par for the task. Because this is a tough business. And sometimes if you're not 100% prepared, that might be an obstacle for future assignments. So make sure that you're ready, make sure that you're prepared, make sure that you know the person or at least have exchanged with the person you're going to be working with, just to make sure that you feel comfortable in going back to the booth. And I hope that helped and was not too discouraging.
No, I think that was excellent. What if you don't have a buddy interpreter in your language pair? You mentioned, what if you were only doing Spanish, German, and you're in the United States and it's not the most
and I don't have
pair.
anybody. Yes, perfect. Yes, of course that happens. And actually that is not a problem because vocabulary issues, you can usually spot yourself very easily. The benefit of working with somebody who does not speak your target language is that they can focus on a lot of other things. They can focus on your delivery. So they will tell you if you sounded choppy, if it seemed like you left sentences unfinished, if you had a lot of filler words, if you had to correct yourself a lot, if you had a lot of false starts. So that is definitely also an advantage because somebody who listens to you who does not speak your language will focus on a lot of other things that the speaker of that a speaker of your same language would probably not even notice. So don't let that be an impediment.
Maritza, how do we go about getting our proof of taking this webinar? You will receive an email with a certificate within 24 hours. The presentation will not be shared, but the recording will be on the website. And I know Carola has a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern time. Maybe we take one more question. Just to try and summarize the presentation. How do you think about where to start? Let's say if you're a beginner interpreter, and then let's say you're a more seasoned interpreter. How would you think about if
I'm a beginner interpreter and I want to get where? Because that is always the big question.
Well, it's all relative to where you are in your career, what you want to work on. And the reflective practice helps to inform that. But how do you think about it? How do you think about reflective practice? How do you think about the one area you want to focus on?
So I always think about what my next goal is. What is my next step in the career? And I always think about where I want to be in a few years. And of course, I have a background from my home country and I came to the US with a specific kind of baggage and knowledge. And I came to the conclusion that I had to recertify, that what I had done in the past was very useful, but it was not going to serve me if I wanted to have an interpreting career here in the US. So I started researching and I started to look at what I needed to do to become certified in the courts, at the state level, what I needed to do at the federal level, what any medical certification would also be helpful for that, and so on and so forth. And that is how I geared my practice and said, okay, let's focus on maybe on the state certification for court interpreters first, because I have a background in legal translation, and that was going to be probably the easiest certification for me to attain. So I did a couple of classes, I did a lot of court observation hours, I practiced hours and hours and hours until I passed the exam. And so on and so forth. And I did the same. Okay, well, the federal exam wasn't offered that year. So, okay, by the time they offered the federal exam, I was ready. I mean, I had done my research, I had prepared, I had studied by myself with other people, I had taken classes. I did not make a lot of money the first couple of years that I was in the US because I was reinvesting almost everything that I made in training and in using the skills that I had learned in the past and adapting them to what I was working on and looking forward to as the next step. And I think that is important for us to see, where am I going? What are the steps that I need to take in order to get there? And then take your time. This is not a rush. You're not in a rush to get where you want to be. If it takes you 5 years, it takes you 5 years. If it takes you 2, it takes you 2. If you can accomplish it by 6 months and not be burned out, then that's wonderful. But the most important thing is to take care of ourselves, do it at our own pace, and make sure that we do not burn out in the way, because this is a very demanding profession. It is very taxing, and we need to make sure that we have enough time to rest in between, just to make sure to recharge and, be at peace with ourselves.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. And this is just a reminder for everyone that this is just bonus area. We're just answering questions. Carola's gracious enough to stay on with us, but you are not required to stay on past the hour mark.
No, and I have to leave now because otherwise I'm going to be late for my next assignment.
So thank you so much for joining us, Carola.
Thank you all for being here, and I'm sure that John will answer any other questions that you might have about upcoming training courses. And hopefully I will see you soon at one of my training courses in the next coming months.
Hopefully. Thanks so much, Carola.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.